So good morning, my name is Chris Curry. I am Principal of the Pensions Dashboards Programme at the Money and Pension Service, and I'm delighted that you could join us this morning for this webinar to talk you through the Pensions Dashboards Programme Progress Update Report, the fifth Progress Update Report that we've done in the lifetime of this programme, and we will be covering progress on the programme from the last update report in October 2021 up until April 2022. I'm delighted to be joined today by Richard James, the Programme Director of the Pensions Dashboards Programme, who will help talk you through some of the progress that we've made, and also Lucy Stone, who is Business Lead at the Pensions Regulator, who will give us an update on what the regulator's approach will be to communications, compliance and enforcement as part of that. And obviously it's a very important part of the programme for us to work so closely with the other organisations involved in delivering pensions dashboards. The update itself is now available to view from our website. So after this webinar, please do feel free to go and have a look and see what we have in there in slightly more detail. Just to let you know that this session is being recorded and will be published on our website after the event. And there will be time for questions and answers at the end of this session. We will try and leave as much time as possible for that. If you'd like to enter your questions into the question box that you should be able to see, then we will be able to answer them. If we don't have a chance to answer them all today, we will try and get back to you after the event with answers to any of the more involved questions that might come up. But now, having set out what we are planning to do, without any further ado, I'll hand over to Richard James, who will start to take us through the presentation. Richard, over to you.
Super, thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're delighted to have the latest progress update report published because there is an awful lot to share with you about what the programme has been up to since we last put an update out. I will start just by giving you a quick reminder of where we are in the programme's overall life cycle, because we've seen a huge amount of change and development since September of last year. So the picture on the screen at the moment is our broad phase activity plan, which many of you will probably recognise. We've been publishing this as part of our progress update reports for quite some time now. We are at the moment deep in the thick of number 2 there, our develop and test phase, which is the point in the programme's life cycle where we are actually building the core architecture that's going to underpin pensions dashboards and testing it very, very thoroughly. We entered that phase in September of last year, which is the point at which we brought Capgemini and Origo, our technology suppliers, in to work with the programme. We completed our procurement exercise and brought them in to start the development of the actual infrastructure that will underpin pensions dashboards. This phase is going to run through to around about summer of this year. We're expecting to hit September, by which time we will have completed that core technology development and thoroughly tested it, plugged it all together, integrated it, and be ready to start some voluntary onboarding of our very first data providers and dashboard providers to actually start using dashboards in live. And as I say, we expect to get there around about September of this year. So during this develop and test phase, the point we're in at the moment, we've been running through a discovery phase with our suppliers, the initial build phase in which we're actually constructing the technology, and we call that our alpha phase. And we've done that at massive pace. We've had essentially 6 months in which to do the build. So we started in September, as I say. We've done a discovery exercise for 3 months, 6 months to do the build itself, and then we move into a 3-month period running through from June until the end of August, in which we will be doing a lot of very rigorous testing prior to moving into phase 3 here. So that's sort of broadly where we are in the overall context of the things. As you can see, the next phase will be about voluntary onboarding and ongoing testing, a little bit more about how we're preparing for that in a moment. And then as we move into those later stages of staged compulsory onboarding, and then eventually getting to a dashboards available point, we know that the timing for those may still move around a little bit. You will have seen the DWP consultation earlier in the year, which has started to set out some proposals for that staged onboarding timing. And there will, of course, be an update on that coming out in due course, which will confirm what that timing will look like. But headline here very much that the programme is absolutely on track with where we expect to be at this point. We are nearing the end of that build phase and it's going well. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the more detail of what we have accomplished since October 21. So, some really big headlines in here. We brought our suppliers in to work with the program to do that technology development in September of last year. And we had an initial 3-month window that ran through sort of September, October, and November, where we were doing what we call discovery, which is essentially our period of working with those suppliers to firm up some more detail, to firm up requirements and solution design, so that we were all clear that by the time we got to the start of the alpha build phase, we knew what we were building. We'd worked through any of those outstanding technical queries about what that should look like, and we were ready to hit the ground running and actually do some build and some development activity around it. That discovery period concluded at the end of November successfully. And we transitioned into our alpha phase, which is the the core build of the digital architecture and some of that initial testing. We've been building ever since December, and we are now at a point where we are nearing the end of that build and development phase. That will conclude at the end of next month in May. But actually, an awful lot of the core components of that infrastructure have now been built and demonstrated to us by the supplier. So if we look at things like the pension finder service, the consent and authorization service, and that view functionality that we're going to have in the architecture, the build on that is actually finished now. And we're now in a phase where we are plugging all of that together and integrating it to get it all working really well together. That's going to define an awful lot of our effort across the remainder of April and May, so that by the time we get to the end of May, we have not only done the build, but we have plugged it all together, and we will have a fully working dashboards infrastructure ready to underpin the going live of that architecture. So that's a huge step forward for us. We've also, since October, selected 3 potential commercial dashboard providers who are working with us during this alpha testing. And we are very grateful to those alpha providers because they are doing some development. They are looking at how their own dashboards could ultimately work, and they'll be working with us as we move into this integration and test phase during May and beyond as we move into the summer to prove that that architecture works in a real world environment, supporting some actual potential dashboards out there as well. And of course, alongside those 3 potential commercial dashboard providers, we are working with the 7 data providers who had already volunteered to work with us during alpha. They're testing the other end of that ecosystem to make sure that the data that they fire into it works, gets its way through that ecosystem infrastructure as it needs to arrive with those potential commercial dashboard providers. So lots of hard work gone in from all of those delivery partners to get us to this point with their own development having matured very well, and to get us to the point where we are now ready to start plugging all of that together and proving that it works end to end. So the further sort of big development that we announced at the start of this year was the appointment of our interim identification verification provider, easy to say, and we were delighted to announce the appointment of DigiIdentity into that role, who'll be working with us across the course of the next 2 years or so to provide identity verification services as part of dashboards. We have already integrated their identity service into that infrastructure and proven that that works. So again, as part of that build activity we've done, big step forward for us there in demonstrating that that actually works and plugging it all together. Huge amount of focus over the last few months on the consultation that DWP have been running on the draft regulations. We published from the programme some draft standards to underpin those, which we'll get a bit more on that a little bit later in the presentation, but that covers things like design standards, how should dashboards work, and some of the technical standards around how people ought to connect into that ecosystem in due course. So big area of focus there on supporting that consultation process, getting more information out to you in industry about what will happen and when, how you will go about connecting to dashboards, and really starting to give you some of that tangible detail that I know you've been looking for that helps you to do your planning and start your own readiness activities so that you are prepared for when we get to that compulsory staged onboarding phase from next year. An awful lot of research has been going on across the development window as well. 2 types of that. We've published a summary of all of our qualitative research, which has really moved us forward in terms of understanding what users need from this. And alongside that, we've been doing some really good user testing and user research to look at what works and what doesn't work in terms of dashboard presentation for the citizen, to make sure that we are building something that absolutely gives them information that is meaningful, that is useful, and that will drive better retirement planning for them. So a huge amount of work has gone on there, which has fed into those design standards and the guidance that we will be publishing, setting out how these dashboards can best present information to citizens. So huge amount of progress. We are really motoring at massive speed here. We built an entire ecosystem in quite a short space of time. And as I say, we are bang on track with where we need to be with that. Let's turn now to where we go next. So it's a bit of a flavour of where we have been. What's coming up between now and October 2022? As I say, we finish the build effort itself at the end of next month, and then across the course of the summer, we will continue to work with suppliers and those delivery partners, the data and dashboard alpha participants, to integrate all of those different components of technology, prove them end to end, get data flowing through the entirety of that architecture, right the way from that data provider level through to dashboard provider, and ensure that that works really, really well. And by the time we get to sort of the end of August, we expect to have proven that ready by the time we get to sort of September-ish through to October, ready for those very first small numbers of users and real world data to be flowing through that dashboards ecosystem. So this thing is becoming really, really real now. The build is there, and we are actually able to look ahead now to that point where we can get real users into this, ready to start seeing their own dashboards. As I say, the dashboard build itself is pretty much there. We've been looking as well, and we'll continue to look at, over the course of sort of the summer, at the onboarding processes for data and dashboard providers. This is really, really important work. We know that there is an awful lot of work for all of you to do in industry to get ready to onboard to this, and we've been looking at the design and how we will run those onboarding processes and what support you might need in order to be ready for that onboarding when it comes around. We've learned an awful lot by working with those alpha test organizations, and we are really, really grateful to them for that, because that has allowed us to already design onboarding processes for both data and dashboard providers that we think will run slickly and smoothly. And we will be publishing over the course of the summer some of the learning that we have taken from that around how to prepare for this stuff. What's the learning that you're going to need to apply to be ready to onboard? So watch this space for some more information on all of that. We will go on refining those processes in response to what we have learned, and we will update the information that we publish on our data and dashboard provider information hubs on our website to help support your readiness activities. We will continue our work on those data technical reporting and design standards that I've talked about, with a view to consulting on those over the course of the summer. They're really, really important products because they will tell you how to go about connecting to that dashboards ecosystem and what your technology needs to do in order to connect into those dashboards. A huge amount of work gone into those already, and we expect to consult on those as we get through into the summer to gather formal views on where we've got to. We will also be publishing an update on consumer protection. This is a huge part of the dashboards program. We need to make sure that this is safe and secure for our consumers, and that the right liability protections, for example, are in place, and also that industry, by way of data providers and dashboard providers, are really, really clear on what they can trust. So, for example, that ability to trust an identity assertion that comes from our identity provider, and PDP taking some responsibility for giving accurate identity verifications there. So we'll be publishing some further information on how all of those different forms of liability and consumer protection interact to make sure that this is a safe environment for all of our customers and for all of those participants in the ecosystem, so that everybody knows what you're signing up to and what you need to have in place to do this safely, and how we will protect consumer interests to ensure that they are safeguarded throughout the process. So that's our areas of focus across the course of the summer, and a bit of a look back at where we have been as well. I'm going to hand you back to Chris now, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of those standards that we are working on producing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Richard. Very helpful overview and focus on some of the areas that we're going to be covering. I'm going to come on to a couple more in a minute. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please do start to put them in the question box so we can get into them as soon as we finish the presentations. But as Richard said, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the key work that we're going to be doing in developing standards over the coming months. As you can see on the screen there are probably two different types of standards that we're going to be working on. So those which are standards and guidance that participants, so you, organisations, data providers and pensions dashboards will be implementing to help you kind of understand what it is that you need to do. And then the code of connection, or affectionately known within the PDP as COCO, which will be the more technical standards that we'll be issuing to help on the technical side everyone to understand exactly what it is that needs to happen. So just to go through those a little bit, obviously on the standards there's data standards, which hopefully a lot of you will already have seen. We published draft versions of these last year and again earlier this year, and that provides the kind of data formatting requirements that pension providers must follow when they return the pensions data back to the ecosystem. There's also the technical standards, which shows how pension providers and dashboard providers actually interface with the central digital architecture and each other. And that would include things like the connectivity mechanisms and protocols, as well as more information about the generation and registration of pension identifiers, which are a very important part of the system, or PEIs, again, as they're known in shorthand. Something which I know that potential dashboard providers are very, very interested in, as well as data providers, are the design standards. And this is really going to focus on what's going to be required for the presentation of pensions data on dashboards, as well as some design issues, accessibility, excuse me, the messaging that will appear alongside figures on dashboards, some of the signposting and the onward customer journeys, they will all be covered in the design standards. And then finally in this area, the reporting standards. So that's the data that we will be requiring from pensions dashboards and from pension providers, which will help us to monitor the health of the ecosystem, to look at things like the compliance and performance to see how well the system is operating. On the more technical side, on the code of connection, some really, really important areas there. Security standards, as you'd expect, this is very high on our agenda, so that the kind of technical, procedural, physical and people standards that are going to ensure that the ecosystem is secure and so people can use it in confidence. So we'll be doing a lot of work in that space. The service standards for a service, which this is, there will be minimum service requirements, things like service availability and response times, software compliance, how to deal with failed requests. A lot of the stuff that will be happening on a day-to-day basis will need to be set out, and we'll be putting those into the service standards. The operational standards, which covers processes for connection to the ecosystem, such as onboarding procedures and dispute resolution. So again, some really, really important areas there, which you will all need to know in order to start the connections and to maintain the connections as we go through. And finally, testing standards. Even when it's up and running, we'll need to make sure that everything is operating securely and properly. So this will cover things like conformance and technical protocols, which organisations will need to meet, in order to be connected and to maintain those connections. So a quite broad range of standards in a whole range of different areas, which, as Richard said, we will be developing with our alpha participants and our working groups. So we have a data working group, usability working group, and also ecosystem and integration testing working groups as well, which we will be using over the next few months, all with the aim of feeding this into the development of these standards, which we are planning to publish, as Richard mentioned, over the summer, as soon as the Department of Work and Pensions has published the response to the consultation and policy is in a relatively stable state. That's when we'll be able to share the drafts of those standards with you and to take formal consultation before we finalise them just after the draft regulations are published. So if we could also now move on to some further areas that we'll be working on, some very important ones. Working with our partners, as I mentioned, and Lucy is going to come on and talk about how TPR will be working with us and what their expectations are in a couple of slides' time. But we're working, for example, with the Department for Work and Pensions digital team to include the state pension data in the testing window. So again, Richard mentioned that for later this year. We think it's very important that the state pension is one of the early adopters, an important part of what's in the ecosystem early on. As I mentioned, the publication of the consultation response on the regulations is expected early in the summer, and we will follow that with our publication on the standards, and the regulations will be laid as soon as a parliamentary timetable allows for that, which will be later this year. And of course, the FCA, one of our other partners, is doing work in a number of different areas, including looking at the policy statement and handbook rules for the FCA regulated pension providers, which will mirror in some way those provided by the regulations for DWP on the pension provider side, but also looking at how to develop the regulatory framework that we'll be applying to qualifying pensions dashboard operators. And I think there are plans for that to be consulted on the framework later in this year. So as you can see, it's not just the work going on within PDP that's important. There are a whole host of other areas of activity with our delivery partners, which are just as important to helping us meet the deadlines that we are setting in the delivery of pensions dashboards as we go forward. And I'm delighted that the progress with all our partners has been exactly as we had expected it to be, and everyone is working along on that same time schedule. But of course, as well as working with delivery partners, one of the most important groups to work with is the industry itself. And on the next slide, we have a little bit about how we can help you get ready for connection. So we've talked about a lot of the work that we are going to be doing. And it's vitally important to us that we keep you abreast of everything that we're doing and give you the information that will help you meet your deadlines and your connections as soon as possible. So we are committed to maintaining and updating regularly the pages on our website on the Data Providers Hub, which draws together all the information that the providers, schemes and integrated service providers are going to need in order to prepare to connect to pensions dashboards. And we're also kind of replicating that with our pensions dashboard provider hub, which gives similar information to potential dashboard providers. And as we develop and evolve all of the areas we've been talking about over the next 6 months, we will make sure that this information is updated on a regular basis so that you in the industry are very aware of what's happening, what you can do and how you can get help in order to meet the connection timetables that will be set later in this year. So that was a very quick run through and update of what's been going on in PDP. I'm now delighted to hand over to Lucy, who will give more of an update on the communications approach, monitoring and enforcing compliance from the pensions regulator perspective. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity for me to come and talk about TPR's work and what we're doing. By way of background, I mean, hopefully most of you know this, but our role at TPR, the pensions regulator, we regulate occupational pension schemes, and we work closely with the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, that regulates personal pension schemes. Just as a way of background, we at the regulator are hugely excited by pensions dashboards because it's a big opportunity to change how savers interact with their pensions, help them find lost pots, help them better plan for retirement. But also it drives much needed investment in data and systems within the industry. I think it's fair to say that data and hasn't been given maybe the attention it deserves over time, but also that the industry has not always harnessed the technological opportunities out there. And this is creating a huge impetus to get to that. In terms of what we have to do, there are around 3,000 pension schemes that are in scope of the draft regulations that DWP put forward. And they are at very different starting points on their journey to being dashboard compliant. We recognise that. We recognise that it's a big change for industry. There's a lot of work that is required to get there. But we've also seen firsthand industry's ability to rise to these challenges and deliver incredible changes in order to really help savers. This industry is really passionate about protecting savers and ensuring savers have good pension outcomes. And I have great faith in industry's ability to rise to this challenge. So what are we doing? So Richard and Chris have been talking about what PDP has been doing about setting up the technological infrastructure. Obviously, DWP has been setting up the regulatory and legislative structure. Where we are is that it's important for us to make sure that these 3,000 occupational pension schemes comply with dashboard duties, because it will only be useful for savers if they can see all their pensions, and therefore that relies on pension schemes complying. We, again, in recognition of the fact that this is quite a big change for industry, we are bringing to bear all the experience we've learned through automatic enrolment. That was a very big change and very successfully delivered. So what we're trying to do, we want to maximise the compliance of occupational pension scheme with their dashboard duties, and we're going about it in 3 ways, which I'll talk about today. One is a very comprehensive communications campaigns. The second bit is by working very closely with industry, and in particular the people who help trustees and scheme managers in meeting their duties: administrators, administration software providers, and new emerging integrated service providers. But finally, we are also looking at about how we are going to, in practice, monitor and enforce compliance with the duties when they go live. So looking at the first one of these, comprehensive community, I'll ask you to just move forward the slide, please. Caroline? Fabulous, thank you. So we are going to be producing products to help trustees and scheme managers to understand their duties and what they need to do to comply with these. And we're going to publish some initial guidance in May, and we are going to be updating it throughout the year, and in particular in November when the regulations are firmed up and PDP standards have been through consultation and are confirmed. We are going to use lots and lots of different channels and ways of reaching trustees and scheme managers. This could be through industry events, in the media, and trade media in particular. We know that one thing that works very well is partnership communications. So this is where we actually provide materials to providers or administrators or industry bodies to share with their clients and their memberships to promote our messages and widen the people who get to see our materials and understand what they need to do. We are going to be working very closely with the schemes we already have in one-to-one supervision. Most of these are the very largest schemes, and they are the very earliest to connect. So we'll be working closely with them, all the very largest schemes, and we've got an industry outreach program where we talk to the largest administrators, the largest admin software providers, and the largest integrated service providers. And I should say, this is not just about us saying, here are our messages, here's what you need to do. It's actually really important that it's a two-way conversation. At this time, I'd like to really send a huge thanks to the work industry has put so far into it. I'm sure Richard has mentioned it in his blog, but there has been a huge amount of goodwill, creativity, innovation, input, passion from industry, feeding into DWP, feeding into PDP, and feeding to us to make this a reality. But it's important that that dialogue continues. It's a big change. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to go wrong. And it's really important that we talk and we work collaboratively with PDP and with industry to solve problems as they arise and innovate to make sure this works properly. We are also going to be doing nudge communications. It's a very jargony term, but effectively what this means is that we will be writing to all trustees at least 12 months before their staging deadline. And we are going to be setting out what their duties are. There are going to be multiple communications over time, which will evolve as they get closer to their connection deadline, their staging deadline. These will go to pension trustees and scheme managers, but we will also ask them to nominate an administrative support, the doer who's actually going to help them comply, to make sure that they understand what needs to be done. So this is our communications and engagement plan. On the other hand, we will also be working on our compliance and enforcement approach. So we intend for this to be data-led. One of the key pieces of work we've been doing with PDP is making sure that we get information from the architecture that PDP is building to TPR to help us identify where people aren't complying. So for example, where they've not connected by their deadline. Or provide us with data that can help us identify potential risks. So for example, where there might be issues with the quality of the data or gaps. We are going to be leveraging a range of powers to enforce compliance. We have new powers that have been proposed in the regulations. These are designed to help us operate at scale. So compliance notices, third-party compliance notices, and penalty notices. On third-party compliance notices, these are powers that help us take action where it's not the trustee or scheme manager who is responsible for the error, but actually another party has caused them to fail. So for example, if something the administrator, the ISB or an employer has done, which means they can't comply, we can go and talk to that third party. We have existing wider powers which help us, for example, gather information and investigate issues. And actually, if we find something really, really problematic with a scheme, we do have wider powers to look at governance and remove and replace trustees. So we're looking at a range of regulatory tools to help us regulate compliance. We are working on our CNE policy, so our compliance and enforcement policy. This is a document that sets out what you can expect from us in terms of compliance and enforcement, what we will be monitoring, the factors we will consider, the powers we may use. We will be publishing this for consultation, but just as a heads up, our intention is to continue, as we like to be at the regulator, to be pragmatic, recognise the challenges and the issues faced by industry and work with them to resolve these. But we will be robust where there is willful non-compliance. There is no excuse not to try and do this. And we will not take fondly to people who take that attitude. So that's a brief overview of the work we're doing at the regulator. I have to say it's obviously very busy for us because we're working with PDP and DWP on the regs and all this, but I think it's also hugely exciting because we're really starting to see pensions dashboard, grow and in pace and momentum and happen, which for me is quite exciting, certainly. Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And thank you as well as for the presentation for your continued ongoing hard work and support from the Pensions Regulator for the Pensions Dashboard Programme. It really does make a difference when you have that enthusiasm from external organisations as well as within PDP. So thank you very much. We're now going to go on to a question and answer session. There are a few questions which have already started to come in, so thank you very much for that. Please do keep them coming. I'm going to start off with the question which I think I'm going to address to Richard, which is coming from Charlotte Morris, which is about the FCA consultation paper published in February that states that all FCA regulated pension providers must be ready for staging by June 2023. This seems to contradict previous timelines, which stated that only the largest master trust would be expected to be ready for this date. Is there any clarification that we can give as to whether that guidance from the FCA is correct or whether timings have changed?
Yes, thank you. So this is pretty consistent, I think, with the call for information that went out on this. So the FCA are proposing some transitional arrangements for smaller providers, and that I think in the FCA's consultation it says they are proposing an implementation deadline of the 30th of June 23 for pension providers for personal and stakeholder pension schemes. That is the same deadline as is proposed for master trusts in the government's consultation, and means that those firms and schemes would be the first to connect to MAPS's digital architecture. But the consultation does also go on to say that smaller providers will be able to rely on a transitional provision to stage on the 31st of October 2024. To do that, they would need to notify FCA by the 30th of April 2023. So we think that's a pretty consistent position in there. Hopefully that helps to clarify the the role of that deadline for those smaller providers.
Thank you, Richard. A couple more that have come in. There's one here which I think might be for Lucy, which is about pension scheme data. And it says, given that from Alan Salomon, I think it is, given that pension scheme data such as name or even dates of birth and NI number may not always be correct and identical across pension schemes, will PDP or MAPS be responsible for helping members with that, or who will?
That's an interesting point. So we have actually set out expectations in terms of record keeping or data quality a long time ago. I think we first set them out in 2010. We provide various guides to help schemes measure the quality of their data and improve it. PASA provides a guide on data quality, how you can identify common issues with some of these key elements, as you cited, dates of birth, national insurance number. So there are a lot of tools available for industry to improve their data. And actually, this is something they should have been doing, and this is something they definitely should do now if they haven't done so already. It's also important to know that when you do matching, so this is how you identify a saver based on the information you received from the system, you will receive multiple fields of data and you will be able to match them across your multiple fields of data. You will decide which of those data fields are the most appropriate for you to use for matching. But it does mean that where you, for example, don't have confidence in the date of birth or the national insurance number, you will have the possibility of saying, I think I've got someone, but I'm not 100% sure. And then that lets the saver have that information, and then they can contact you and going, it's me, here's my information, here's how I can prove that it is me. So it's built into the system that if there are issues with the quality of data, you can do something called a partial match or possible match, where you can say, I think I've got you, but I'm not 100% sure. But obviously the first priority has to be to improve your data and use the guidance that's available out there to do so.
Thank you, Lucy. Very, very helpful and very clear, I think. And a kind of, I guess, in a way, wake-up call that those organisations that haven't been doing this probably should. Now's a good time to get started to do it before you start to find a number of partial matches, I guess. So next question, I think was almost a kind of a statement, but I think it's worth exploring to give us an opportunity to spell out what we know and understand about the timelines, I think, at the moment. So this is coming from Mark Edwards saying that about consulting on data standards in the summer, they presumably won't be in a position to reply to the consultation until autumn or winter, which won't give phase one providers an awfully long time to implement any changes made following the consultation response in time for onboarding in spring or summer 2023. So Richard, maybe if you could just say a little bit about what we know in that area and what our expectations are.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really happy to. It's probably worth setting out first just why we're looking at the summer for that consultation. And there's essentially a sequence of activity that's needed around some of this. So you will all be aware, of course, that the DWP consulted on the draft regulations themselves a short time ago and are currently working through the analysis of all the representations that have been received in response to that consultation. Only once they publish their conclusions on the back of that will we then be able to consult on the draft standards, and that's because it is those regulations that give us the power to set those standards. So that's the broad sort of sequencing and why we have to structure these things in the way that we are doing. What I would therefore expect to happen is if that DWP consultation has led to any big changes in the kinds of data that would be expected to be on dashboards, that would be set out when the DWP publishes its initial response to that consultation. So you would get that, pretty early. The standards themselves then turn that into detailed technical guidance about how to apply that information about, the broad types of data that need to be on those dashboards. We've actually already published some standards which are structured around what we expect to be on those dashboards and the proposals that were set out in the DWP consultation itself. They've been out there for a little while now and are actually pretty mature. They're not really moving very much at all. So it's only in the event that there were a really big shift in what we expect to be on dashboards that I would expect to see those move very much. So there's actually quite a bit out there already that would help you now to start thinking about preparing your data for that staged onboarding. So, my encouragement, I guess, would be to engage with what's out there now. The standards are there, they're pretty mature, they're pretty stable. Start doing that readiness thinking now. If there is to be any change in that, you'll get a good early warning on that on the back of the DWP response to consultation. And so, there's lots of stuff there to start getting ready, even now. Between all of that, my sense is that should give plenty of information, plenty of warning for people to start doing that readiness thinking, right up front.
Thank you, Richard. And on a similar theme, I guess, in terms of talking about timings and when things will be starting, we've had a question come in from William Gervin, who said, is there likely to be any allowances made for the extra work required for the McLeod or Sargent judgment?
Yeah, thank you, William. Great question. Look, the short answer to this is that we've heard those representations around the work that needs to be done by those pension schemes in response to that judgment. That came across loudly in the DWP consultation exercise, and the analysis of those responses is underway at the moment. And I would say that if there were to be any change, that will be set out in the DWP response. Clearly, we can't anticipate yet what that might look like and whether there might be any of that change. We'll need to await that DWP response, but that's the thing to look out for that will give you the answer to that question.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Richard. And similar, another question is coming from Oliver, asking about whether we have any visibility on whether the staging timeline set out in the consultation will change when the final regulations are published. And I guess the answer that you've just given kind of suggests that there's nothing, that no insight that we have at the moment. But the follow-up is should schemes assume the staging profile is final and begin their planning on that basis? And I think if I can prejudge what you're likely to say, I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the initial set of proposals has gone out there in that consultation. There may very well be some movement in that. We simply don't know yet. But of course, as soon as the DWP publish their response, we will be able to tell you that. But if I were leaving you with any message from today, I think it would be that the program is really, really motoring at speed. The architecture is pretty much there. It's largely built. So this thing's going to happen. We're on track. It's motoring really fast. And I would encourage all parts of industry to be doing that readiness thinking and taking those preparatory steps now to make sure that you are ready as well. If there were to be any movement out to the right in response to that DWP consultation, well, it doesn't hurt to be ready for the earlier dates, does it? You've got yourself in a good position, notwithstanding any of that.
No, good advice. Thank you very much, Richard. So now thinking about the other end of the process, if you like, and dashboard providers and dashboards rather than the data providers. And then another question from Charlotte Morris: are there guidelines currently available for dashboard providers which outline what they are permitted to use pensions data for? And if not, are these being developed?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. It's another great question. There's a principle that sort of underpins the entire pensions dashboards ecosystem at the moment, which is that we do not intend to persist within that ecosystem any of the personal data that relates to the holders of those pensions. So essentially, the way this thing is constructed is that somebody will do a pension find request. The PEI number is the sort of the pensions identifier. That is an anonymized product that means none of that pensions data itself gets retained anywhere within that dashboard's ecosystem or within the dashboards themselves. So that's an absolute fundamental that we are applying to the build of all of this. The work that I think still is being thought about, and you'll start to see some thinking set out on this when the FCA consults on the regulatory regime for dashboard providers later, is what might happen by way of onward journeys from those pensions dashboards. So if the dashboard itself doesn't retain that data, and therefore by inference, the dashboard providers can't use that data for other purposes, we know that there may very well be a case for onward journeys that would allow people to then act on the basis of what those pensions are telling them. That would need separate consents. It would need a separate approach to that. But that sort of thinking is being done at the moment to say, how might we accommodate that user need in a way that is sort of safe and consistent with the wider regulatory framework. So broad principle, the dashboards itself won't hold that data and therefore won't support reuse, but we know that there is a use case potentially for those onward journeys, and there's thinking being done about how to make those safe. So watch this space, FCA to consult later in the year.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard. A couple of questions now, I think, looking at the kind of intermediary ISP, integrated service provider market. One from Phil Norton. I'm not sure if Richard or Lucy or maybe both might be interested in this one, but I'll ask the first part of the question: how many ISPs are likely to enter the market? So do we have any kind of thoughts or intelligence on what we think is likely to evolve there?
Yeah, shall I go first, and then Lucy might want to add to it. So we are expecting a market to emerge here. We're having some good conversations with a range of different organisations who are considering entering that ISP market, or in the case of ITM Altus, have already announced their intention to do so. So we are expecting there to be a good degree of capacity in that market. I won't obviously prejudge the commercial announcements that I'm sure will come from those organisations, but it's giving us a good degree of confidence that there's going to be a range of providers, a range of capacity out there that will be geared up to help the rest of industry step up and connect to dashboards.
Sorry, yes, absolutely. We are expecting more than one ISP to enter the market, obviously. But this is a good example of the work I was talking about, where we're talking to industry about how it is supporting trustees and managers in meeting their duties. Integrated service providers are likely to be an absolutely key component of making this work, and so it's really important for us to talk to all those who are emerging to make sure that they do have the capacity, that's all on track, especially as we go through the staging profile I set out with DWP and we end up with the medium schemes who are more likely to need the services of an ISP. I mean, they're very unlikely to connect directly themselves to the ecosystem. So we are going to be having ongoing conversation with ISPs about their capacity and how they are evolving their business models to cater for the small end of the market.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Lucy. Very helpful, and thanks very much, Richard. a question which I am going to ask now, which is quite a technical one. So this might test you, Richard, as to how much detail you're happy to go into today. But it's a question that's come in from James Sheehan, who's asked, who is responsible for building the technological processes that identify partial matches versus full matches? Is that being tackled as part of the PDP architecture, or will that be passed on to ISPs or data providers to design? So, Richard, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for the question, James. And I'm going to try and keep this completely non-techy, partly because I find that a lot easier and it's probably a lot more helpful. The broad shape of that answer is that the responsibility for matching itself and the designing of those matching processes rests at the data provider end of things. The architecture will support the return of both partial and full matches. But the question of how to design those algorithms and to give yourselves the confidence that you have achieved a match is going to rest at the data provider end of things. There's a couple of things help with that though, and crucially is that the role of the identity provider is really important, because that is going to mean that you can absolutely rely on data that comes into you, where if somebody purports to be Richard James, you can have confidence that that is indeed Richard James, and therefore the bit you need to focus on is exclusively that matching, which is to take as true those data attributes that you are being told about Richard James from the ecosystem, and to relate those to your records. You've got confidence in the identity, but how you then do the matching will be your judgment, but the architecture will then support the return of both full and partial matches from you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Very good, very clear. We've just got a couple of others to come through. Please do keep sending in the questions. We've got about 10 minutes left still to answer them. There's one here, Richard and Lucy, which I think we kind of covered, but I think it's worth just taking and spelling out. So what would your advice be to pension providers and schemes who are just starting to look at their duties regarding pensions dashboards?
Lucy, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, first things first, you're here. So that's a good start. You're starting to engage. I think the first thing is to engage with what's already out there. So engage with PDP's guidance, PDP's materials on the website that explains what is going to be required, or at least gives a flavour of what is going to be required for the areas still to be consulted on. You can engage with the DWP consultation. You can look at the staging deadlines as set in that. They will be confirmed later on in the year, but it will give you an idea of when you might have to meet your duties by. There are materials out there which are probably pretty mature. Richard has touched on this. So the data standards, the data you're going to be provided by the ecosystem to match, that's very unlikely to change. And similarly, there's some good guidance that has been put out by PASA about how you might approach matching. All these things are things you can do now. You can start, once you've decided what items you're going to use for matching, you can start looking at what is the data quality, talk to your administrator about what needs to be digitized, and then start improving the quality of the data as well. Obviously, when we launch our guidance, it's very important that you go and engage with that. And it will explain, again, in the same way to the PDP, but for the trustee audience, what are the steps you need to be taking now.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I would agree with all of that. There's some really good stuff already out there, actually. So we've already put on the PDP Data Provider Hub, for example, some material on steps to connection. What are the kind of things that you need to be thinking about, and how far out from the point at which you would need to be onboarding should you be thinking about them? But the kind of things that you might want to be building into your planning thoughts, your planning processes at the moment are absolutely getting your data straight, understanding what you're going to need to submit, and looking at data quality, and you might need to do some some data cleansing and that sort of thing. Thinking about whether you're going to connect through an ISP or directly, that's really really important, and going through an ISP will certainly make your lives easier in a lot of senses, because they will be thinking about things like matching protocols that we touched on just a moment ago, and so using a partner organization like that could make life a lot easier for you. You will probably want to be looking at your own IT development or your data uploads to that ISP, and building that into your business planning cycles at this point, so that you've got resource allocated at the right times to be undertaking those sorts of activities. So there's a huge amount of really good stuff out there, and it is never too early to engage. I think we are absolutely at that point now where this this thing has gone very, very quickly from 9 months ago, when it was really still very much just on the drawing board, to a position where we now have a host of boxes and wires built, and this thing is ready to go. So my encouragement would be, use all of those sources of information, use those industry contacts, really start building this into your business planning activities, and getting tangible activity underway to prepare for these things, because it's going to be upon us before we know it. So early steps now will leave you very well prepared for it.
And can I add one final point? It's also already signed up to PDP's newsletter, because they can keep you updated on the progress of what PDP is doing as time evolves. So you won't have to proactively go and look to see what changes have happened. You will be told when the changes happen on their website. So that's also a very quick and easy way to engage.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Lucy. I think you just advertised us very well, so thank you for that. We have had another question come in from Oliver, which I think I'm going to pose to Richard, which is there any update on how more complex schemes will need to connect to the dashboards? So, for example, schemes with multiple administrators and or AVC providers, are those schemes likely to have a single endpoint, or will each of the administrators or AVC providers connect in their own right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Actually, there's a fair degree of flexibility in this, I think. Now, I'm in serious danger of tramping over some deeply technical content on this, but we do anticipate the potential for there to be multiple endpoints, and we are looking at how we might be able to accommodate that within the architecture. So, for example, it might very well be possible to have data from one scheme going through multiple endpoints. We would envisage that being something that people might want to do. One bit of data should only ever have one endpoint, but I think there is a degree of flexibility about that, and I'm quite happy to give a slightly more technical response to that in writing afterwards, if that would be useful to you, Oliver.
Thank you, Richard. I think that would be helpful, so we can make a note of that. Another question come in, I think just building on something we were talking about earlier about the principle of not storing identifiable data in the architecture. And the question from Chris Roberts is, have we thought about the user experience for partial matches so they don't keep showing up for users when the match ultimately isn't made? Lucy, maybe you will have the first stab at this one.
Yes, so the way partial matches will work is, we've talked about this, you will have sought to match the saver against your records. You found someone who you think might be the saver, but you're not 100% convinced. So you will send a partial match through the ecosystem. And what happens next is that the saver will be provided with your contact data, so they can call the administrator and say, yes, it's me, or yes, it isn't me. So this way, the great beauty of partial matches is what it should do over time is massively reduce the number of partial matches, because as people get in touch, you will know either A, it's definitely not them, or B, it definitely is them, and it becomes a positive match. So there may, over time, you will be able to improve your data. You'll be able to get in touch with savers that you lost touch with a long time ago, and save on things like tracing costs as well. Ideally, if savers are engaging, which they are because they're using a dashboard, the number of partial matches will reduce, and they shouldn't be seeing them again and again.
Very good point, Lucy. Thank you. Richard, anything to add to that?
No, I think Lucy covered the ground admirably there.
Perfect, thank you. We have another question come in, this time from Yvonne Thompson, who's asked who is expected to pay for what in this process. We haven't heard anything, or actually published anything about costs, I guess, in the update report. Richard, did you want to have a quick go at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, so the program is paying for all of the core architecture and stitching together of this, and is also meeting the costs of the identity verification that underpins all of this. So the cost of getting somebody verified, so we are confident that Richard James is indeed Richard James, will be borne by the Pensions Dashboards program. But in terms of the costs of readiness and complying with the obligations around this, we expect those to be borne by industry. There's no sort of government support for that. This is part of any regulatory compliance cost that might fall upon industry. I don't know if that helped, Yvonne. As a summary, feel free to come back with any supplementals.
Yeah, I think it might also be worth mentioning, Richard, that we're expecting dashboards to be free at the point of use for consumers. So there is that, and of course the work that is being done by the Pensions Dashboard Programme is funded through the central government, but some of the work that is funded through the general levy and the pensions levy as well. I think those are well known. So I think the industry is involved in funding it, but in a way it's being shared across all industry. And a lot of the additional work which is being required, I think, is, as Lucy's already pointed out, work which in some cases has already been required previously. So there is a burden on industry, but there is also a big benefit for consumers, I think, from what's happening. I think, given the time, and I think we've now completed the questions that we've got in at the moment that I can see, we will start to draw this webinar to a close. I would just like to say thank you very much to both of our presenters today, to Richard and to Lucy, not just for the excellent presentations, but also for the very comprehensive way they've answered all the questions which have come in today. So thank you very much. And of course, behind the scenes, there are a lot of people to thank in the Pensions Dashboards Programme team for not just making the arrangements and organising and handling the webinar, but also for the progress update report itself and all of the good work that they are doing to make sure that the programme stays on track. As Lucy mentioned, we are very happy for as many people as possible to stay in touch with us as we can. And on the screen at the moment, you can see the ways in which you can connect through either LinkedIn, through Twitter, through the website and our newsletter, so we can keep you up to date with the latest programme, progress on the programme, and make sure that you are put in the best possible position to get yourselves ready for when you are needed to connect, and then on an ongoing basis to manage those connections going forward. We hope you've enjoyed it today. If there are any other follow-up questions, please do get in touch through the contact details that are on your screen at the moment. But on that basis, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again, if not before, in October for the next progress update report. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.